found in the 14th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." He said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink, and cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. When I was a child, summer vacations were always fishing trips. Every year we would pack up all of our gear, take our 14-foot boat, and travel from Southern California up Highway 395 past Bishop to a campground on Rock Creek. From there we could fish in one of the small rivers in the area or take the boat out on Lake Crowley. One year when I was about 7, the owner of Tom's Place, which is now a little town but then was just a local bait shop and general store, decided that we had been coming up there long enough to be told the secret of the great fishing spot. A closely guarded secret known only to the locals. So the next morning, we headed off across the lake to find this haven of large brown trout. After fishing most of the day, and I might add, catching our limits, we headed back across the lake to the boat docks and noticed that a storm was brewing. It had taken us almost an hour to cross the lake in the morning with no wind, and now we had to go back against a strong headwind and a driving rain. The wind created swells that bounced our small boat up and down, adding spray to the rowing, so my parents had my brother and I, Mike was about 10, crawl up under the covered bow of the boat to stay dry. They also pushed the cooler and tackle box and anything else they wanted to stay dry up under there with us. My dad stayed at the front of the boat to man the wheel, which left my mother in the stern bailing like crazy. Mike and I thought it was great fun. It wasn't until many years later that I realized how much danger we had been in. We were up under the bow along with the tackle box and the cooler and everything else they could find, not just to stay dry, but to put as much weight at the front of the boat as possible so the wind and swells would not capsize us. That's why my mom, who was light as a twig, ended up in the back bailing while my dad was steering, protected by the windshield. His weight was needed to keep the bow of the boat down. Well, this is the kind of day that the disciples are having in today's gospel. Well, actually the kind of night, since it was evening when Jesus sent them across the lake. The boat is being battered by the wind and waves and is still far from its destination, far from land, because the wind is against them. It can be a frightening thing to be in a small boat far from shore in a storm, but it's important to notice that the text never says that the disciples were afraid because of the storm. Certainly they must be exhausted. They've spent hours fighting against wind and waves, and they're coming off of a very tiring day of managing a large crowd, that 5,000 plus people that Jesus fed in last week's reading. But they're fishermen who spend a lot of time on the water. They know what to do in a storm. Then, in the midst of their struggle, Jesus comes walking across the water, and now they're terrified. They think he's a ghost. But Jesus speaks to them. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. So Peter speaks up, as he always does. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Jesus responds, come. So Peter gets out of the boat and begins to walk across the water toward Jesus. Of course, we know that something is going to go wrong. Even if we haven't read this particular story about Peter before, all we have to do is look back at what we know about him and, well, we know that something is going to go wrong. And sure enough, Peter notices the wind. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had been rowing against a strong wind for several hours and constantly bailing water out of my boat to avoid sinking, I would have noticed the wind before I stepped out of the boat. But hey, this is Peter. Peter. He's every preacher's favorite disciple. This pillar of faith with a bad case of foot-and-mouth disease. And sure enough, he realizes just what he's done, and he is once again terrified. As he starts to sink, he cries out, Lord, save me. Jesus, of course, immediately reaches out and lifts him up, and they get safely back in the boat. You of little faith, Jesus says, why did you doubt? So what about this very human Peter? Commentators have always placed a big emphasis on the fact that Jesus, after picking Peter up and getting him back into the boat, tells him that he has little faith. For 2,000 years, Peter has been faulted for having little faith. He noticed the wind, remembered the storm, lost his focus, and this, many say, is why he began to sink. A newer thought, at least newer to me, is that Peter is looking for proof of the presence of God, and that's why he left the boat in the first place. Instead of thinking, if he had enough faith, he could have walked on water, what about if he had enough faith, he would have believed the words of Jesus that came to him while he was still in the boat. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. How would that affect the message we take from this story? What I heard as a child and young adult was, if we have enough faith, we can overcome all of our problems in spectacular ways. Faith is the ability to do seemingly impossible things in the face of great adversity. But this message can easily fail us when our lives are shattered by the realities of accident or disease or aging, leaving us feeling guilty over our little faith. God has given us rational minds that tend to think in terms of either or. Either I have great faith or I am weak. That's logical, but it's not true life. Think about our lives, yours and mine. Sometimes we believe absolutely positively that God is with us. God's presence gives us all the strength we need to face whatever life sends our way. But sometimes, other times, we have little faith. This happens to me a lot as I struggle with the complexities of being a pastor. Something I realize now is one of those processes that never ends. But there are many other things in my life that cause me to doubt God's presence. Things that send me out of my boat in search of God, who is sitting back at the oars quietly whispering, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Faith is not being able to walk on water, but daring to believe that God is with us in the boat, made real in the community of faith that surrounds us as our boat, battered by waves, makes its way through the storm.